I doubt that I need to identify the skyline behind me. It's the familiar New York City, probably one of the most important cities in the world.
What we are looking at is the familiar Manhattan Island, and I'm very interested in it because in the heart of the Manhattan Island, a miracle took place back in 1857. It was at the corner of Fulton Street and William Street. It was specifically the North Dutch Reformed Church, and they had recently invited a man to help them. He was under 40 years of age by the name of Jeremiah Calvin Lamphere, a very pleasant and energetic man, warm and friendly, and they asked him to become their city missionary.
They gave him a handful of tracts and allowed him to go down through the narrow streets around Fulton Street and hand these tracts out and see if he could get people to talk to him about Christ. The man started his job on the 1st of July, and before a couple of months had passed, he made two very clear observations. Number one, he noticed that all the businessmen of the city left their office at 12 o'clock, and they were out on the streets from 12 until 1 o'clock, some of them eating their lunch while they walked. The other observation he made was that there were teeming thousands of people in his parish. And if he had 10,000 lives to invest, it wasn't going to be enough to be able to reach all of these people. And so I think, sensitive to the Spirit, he decided to try and yoke these two observations together. He wanted the businessmen to come and hold a meeting, a layman's meeting, and hold it over beside the church in the annex building next door to it on the 3rd floor, where there was a small meeting room. He invited them to come on a Wednesday at 12 o'clock, and they would minister to one another. They would be allowed to lead in a song or in a prayer, or they would be allowed to give a testimony or a word of exhortation. They would not be allowed to monopolize time more than 5 minutes, because some businessmen would only have 10 or 15 minutes maximum in the room. And if they wanted a chance to participate, they ought to be given that chance. There's no way of knowing how his spirit sagged when at 12 o'clock on the 23rd of September, nobody turned up to his meeting. He decided that he'd spend the time in prayer, so he got down on his knees and he started praying. And at 12:30, he heard the first sound of footsteps on the stairway. By the time it came 1 o'clock and the meeting was over, there were 6 of them that had met together. And they were so encouraged at what went on, they decided to meet on the following Wednesday. What happened then is really a matter of record. On that following Wednesday, there were 20 people that came to the meeting. And on the following Wednesday, the 7th of October, there were 40 of them that came to the meeting, and they had to make 2 more decisions. The space that they were meeting in on the 3rd floor of the annex was not large enough. They had to go down to the 2nd floor to get a larger room. Second thing they noticed was that the time wasn't long enough for the number of people that wanted to participate in the service. And so they decided they'd meet on a daily basis. They met the next day, Thursday, and on Friday, and on the following Monday, and the crowd started increasing. And by the following Tuesday, the 14th of October, there were 100 people that stood in pouring rain trying to get into that little annex building and have their meeting and meet for prayer. By the end of the first month, the religious periodical started notifying people about the phenomenon that took place on Fulton Street. That brought people from surrounding communities to observe and to participate. By the end of the second month, they started conducting prayer meetings in other areas around New York City. By the end of the 3rd month, the secular papers got a hold of the information. By the end of the 4th month, the entire facility at Fulton Street was crowded out. They had moved down 1 block to John Street, and that John Street Methodist Church was crowded out. There were 150 meetings being held daily in Manhattan and in Brooklyn. And by the time 6 months had passed, there were 10,000 businessmen that were meeting for prayer daily. This phenomenon attracted the attention of other cities. The first city that tried to capture the same spirit was Philadelphia. They started at a church on 4th Street, found out that was too small. They then went to a larger hall and had to grow beyond that. Theaters started opening their doors to let them in at 12 o'clock, and businesses started closing down and opening their facilities to accommodate the number that were trying to get into the buildings. Then it went from there to Cincinnati. From Cincinnati it moved to Boston, then to Baltimore, then to Washington, Richmond, Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, New Orleans, Vicksburg, Memphis, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Chicago. Eventually it hit nearly every city in the United States. In the year 1858, 1 million people were swept into the kingdom. Having been a teacher, I'm aware of the fact that when you're dealing with a new subject, you must spend some time in a definition of terms. And what I'd like to do at this point, before we go any further in examining what a revival is, I'd like to define it. What is a revival? Revival is the sovereign, sudden, selective, sensational operation of the Spirit of God. It descends amid prayer, produces purity, and reaches the perishing. Let me tell you why I selected those words for a definition. We begin with, it is sovereign. There is nothing that man can do to pull it down or to pump it up. Books by good men have been written on how to have a revival. Godly, dedicated people have put the principles into practice, but never experienced the revival. Revival is alone in God's sovereign will. The great Scottish divine Alexander White, who was touched by the revival in Aberdeen in 1859, said that there is a mystery about revivals. God's sovereignty is in them. I think Jesus put it more succinctly than that when he spoke to Nicodemus. He said, the wind bloweth where it listeth. It is sovereign. It is sudden. It is possible that a man can go with a burden of sin and endure it for a long time. But during a revival, there comes a moment when it is unbearable. Can you imagine a dignified, well-dressed woman in the middle of the city, in the middle of the block, in the middle of the street, in the middle of the day, suddenly fall on her knees and cry from the agony of her heart, "Oh God, have mercy upon me." And when astonished people stand to watch what is happening, she turns to them and appeals, "Can any of you lead me to Christ?" It is that suddenly that revival comes to the soul. When I use the word selective in a definition of revival, it's obvious, though it is difficult to explain or define, it is obvious that God does make a selection as to where the revival will come. The peoples of the United States, the 4 countries of Great Britain, Sweden, some of places in Europe were touched by the revival. But what about the people that lived in Asia? It's obvious that there is a selection. And I think that selection comes in areas that are cultural, that are geographical, and are evangelical. When I use the word cultural, I'm here to illustrate my point at the marketplace in Great Yarmouth. Great Yarmouth is one of the fishing villages on the east seaboard of England next to the North Sea. It happens that in March of 1921, a man by the name of Douglas Brown was preaching in a town that's about 10 miles south of here, known as Lowestoft, and a revival broke out. On the 5th of June in 1921, that revival came to the Park Street Baptist Church here in Great Yarmouth. But it must be distinguished from an event that happened 4 months later. It was the herring season, and men came down from the northeast coast of Scotland and from all over the eastern seaboard of this country, and they came here for the herring fishing. Among those people that came down with the fishermen was a man by the name of Jock Troop. He was a rough and a rugged ex-Navy man. And he came down here to go out, and when they came back at the end of the week with their catch, the girls would gut the fish and prepare them for packaging. And then in the afternoon of that Saturday, they would go around Great Yarmouth here and do shopping. But in the evening, they would all assemble here at this marketplace. It was the last Saturday in October, 9 o'clock at night, when these stalls were closing up, that Jock decided that he would use the advantage of trying to reach the people that were around here. He had a powerful voice, and he raised his voice standing on one of the stalls from Isaiah 63 verse 1. Who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah? And he spoke on the man of Bozrah that is mighty to save. There was another strong, sturdy fisherman who was standing in the crowd listening to Jock preaching. And when he heard some words coming from Jock's mouth, he suddenly fell to the ground. He was taken in a trance. He later became a Methodist minister, and he testified to the authenticity of his experience. He said that when he regained his consciousness, he elevated himself from the he was lying. He looked around this marketplace, and the entire place looked like a battlefield. There were fishermen that had been slain by the Spirit lying on the ground all over this marketplace. It was the beginning of a new revival known as the Fishermen's Revival. It traveled all over the eastern coast of Scotland. In fact, every major fishing village on the east coast of Scotland was touched by that revival of 1921. But it had this unique feature. It only traveled through contact with fishermen. The second limitation on a revival is geographical. When a revival comes, it comes regionally. Revival spreads much like a forest fire. A spark will go into adjacent dry timber and spread the conflagration. A person gets into a revival atmosphere and becomes a projectile. He takes it then into another community and the revival spreads, but always within regional limitations. When it came to Britain, it touched England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. But not all at the same time, not all in the same way. They were connected, but they were separate. The third area of limitation to which I draw your attention would be that of the evangelical faith. It's something that I cannot explain. It's definitely something I cannot deny. Whenever the revival came, it came generally to the nonconformist evangelical churches. When it came to them without regard for denominational differences. But it only affected the great liberal denominations in those churches where they give adherence to evangelical tenets in their faith. In Ulster, for example, where the population is largely Protestant and evangelical in faith, every single county was affected by the revival. But in the Great South, largely predominated by Roman Catholics, outside of an experience that happened in Dublin, they were left totally out of the picture of a revival. The fourth word that I used in the definition of terms is the word sensational. It is impossible to define a revival without including that word. Admittedly, there was a Welsh revival that was referred to as the Quiet Revival, but it was the exception to the rule. The sensational manifested itself in various different ways. I go back to St. Mary's Decrepit Church on the 27th of June in 1736, when a man named George Whitfield was preaching his ordination sermon. Whitfield had been brought up in the town, and his parents ran the inn. He was so well known that when he preached this sermon, it was his first, but the building was crammed to its capacity, and there were hundreds of people that were unable to get into the building. He preached with such fervor that a heavy conviction of sin fell upon 15 people, and they acted with such impropriety that the religious periodicals that reported it simply said 15 people went mad. They didn't know how to describe the prostration. There are physical manifestations that come with people who are overtaken with the burden of sin. Sometimes, as in the Ulster case, they show themselves in sleepings. Sometimes it's in deafness and dumbness. In Wales, it was in expressions of songs of rapturous joy. But usually in a revival, there are some forms of prostrations. Noises also are often heard during revival meetings. I give you an illustration of South Africa, where a group of people were conducting a youth meeting. A young polyglot girl had gotten up and had testified to what Christ meant to her there and then, and a holy hush fell upon the audience. Then they heard the distant sound of a coming train. As the sound increased, it was obvious the train was coming directly toward the building. By the time that it hit the walls of the building, the whole room burst into sounds. Some of them were the sounds of saints that were elated with joy over their emancipation from sin. Some of them were the sounds of sinners that were under a deep conviction of sin. It was so disturbing that somebody went and reported to the minister who lived in an adjacent parsonage, and that minister came over to stop this commotion. But he found out that he was unable to do it. And while he was walking back to his parsonage, he suddenly heard the sound of an onrushing train, and it hit him. He became the leader of that revival in South Africa, and he was none other than the saintly Andrew Murray. There is no question. You cannot give a definition of revival without including sensational elements. Having looked at what God did by the Spirit in moving across the United States of America from the island of Manhattan, and taken an examination of what we mean by defining a revival, in Volume 2 and in Volume 3, I want to look at the revival that came to Great Britain. We'll begin in the Midlands of Wales. We'll go up into the hills and cities of Scotland. We'll go down into the capital city of London. And then we'll go over into worn, torn Ulster and see how God moved in a magnificent way and turned those countries upside down with another revival.